Berlin, 1936. Columns march through the streets in impeccably fitted black uniforms. Every seam is perfect. Every crease is precise. Silver insignia gleam in the sunlight. The enemy hasn't seen a single shot fired, but they already feel the pressure. Not from weapons, from appearance. Well-fed, clean-shaven, dressed as if heading to a parade, not a war. Shirts pressed. Boots polished to a mirror shine. Belts fastened with German precision. French soldiers in the trenches wear wrinkled uniforms 3 years old. Polish officers wear patched dress coats. Soviet fighters wear whatever they could scrounge up. And across from them, an army that looks like it stepped off a magazine cover. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't aesthetics. This was a weapon. So how did Nazi Germany transform tailoring into an instrument of psychological warfare? And why did it work better than anyone expected? The answer destroys the notion that military uniforms are just clothing. Hollywood created a myth. Hugo Boss designed the Nazi uniforms. The reality is more complex and more sinister. Hugo Boss was a manufacturer, one of hundreds. The factory in Metzingen had been making police uniforms since 1924. By 1933, the company was teetering on the brink of bankruptcy. Hugo Ferdinand Boss owned a small tailor shop with 20 workers and outdated equipment. Debts were mounting, orders had dried up, and the Great Depression was destroying small businesses throughout Germany. Then, Hugo Ferdinand Boss made a decision that would save his business and stain his name forever. On April 30th, 1931, he applied for membership in the NSDAP and received party card number 508889. Not out of ideology, but out of desperation. The calculation proved correct. In 1933, immediately after Hitler came to power, Boss received his first contracts. Small ones at first, uniforms for local SA divisions, then larger, brown shirts for stormtroopers, then the black SS uniforms. By 1938, the factory had expanded to 300 workers. In 1940, to 400. By 1943, more than 1,000 sets per week were passing through his production. By 1945, over 350,000 sets had gone through his factories. But here's the paradox. Hugo Boss didn't design a single detail of the uniform that made his name synonymous with Nazi aesthetics. The design? Others created it. Two names almost no one knows. Karl Diebitsch, a graphic designer and SS member since the 1920s, and Walter Heck, a professor at the Munich School of Applied Arts. Himmler gives the assignment: create a uniform that will intimidate, instill discipline, distinguish itself from the army, and demonstrate elitism. Diebitsch arrives with a portfolio full of sketches, color schemes, and fabric samples. He had been working on this concept for years, even before the official commission. He knew the SS had to look not like soldiers, but like an order, a knightly order of death. Heck adds academic rigor, refining proportions and silhouettes. He studied historical military uniforms, Prussian hussar uniforms, Napoleonic Guard dress coats, Austrian cavalry parade uniforms. But he took only one thing: the intimidation effect. Diebitsch and Heck choose black. Not gray, not brown, black. Why? Color psychology had been understood for centuries. Black signifies power, fear, death, inevitability. But there's a nuance people miss. In 1932, black uniforms were economically impractical. Black fabric cost more to produce, the dye was more complex, it faded faster, required more maintenance, showed dirt more than gray or brown. But Himmler agreed precisely because of this. Black uniforms were a demonstration of resources, a message. We have enough money to dress the elite in the most expensive fabric. They added silver insignia instead of gold, colder, harsher. The death's head skull, Totenkopf, taken from 18th century Prussian hussar regiments. Double SS runes, designed by graphic designer Walter Heck. High black boots made from the highest quality leather. A white shirt for contrast, symbolizing purity. A black tie to complete the look. But the most ingenious detail: a silver chain connecting the pocket to a button. Zero functional purpose, but enormous visual effect. The chain created an illusion of old aristocracy, pocket watches, hereditary luxury. It transformed a modern thug into a knight of the new order. The uniform was a theatrical costume for state terror, and it worked exactly as intended. Most armies in the 1930s used standard sizes, cheap fabrics, minimal fitting, and quick mass production. Germany took a different path. Textile archaeology and preserved samples show a level of quality that shocks researchers. They used gabardine with tight diagonal weave, the same fabric as expensive civilian suits, the highest quality twill from the best German mills. Wool with synthetic additives starting in the late 1930s, this was cutting-edge technology at the time. The cut was tailored, not baggy like most armies, which made uniforms to grow into, or in universal sizes. German uniforms fit like custom-made civilian suits. Shoulders were built on shoulder pads, creating a V silhouette. Broad shoulders, narrow waist, the ideal masculine figure. Collars fit perfectly against the neck without gaps or discomfort. Sleeves were set at an angle for natural movement, requiring much more complex cutting than the straight sleeves of ordinary military uniforms. The details are impressive even decades later. Double stitching ensured durability. Uniforms were meant to last years, not months. Lining made of viscose or silk, while other armies used cotton or did without lining altogether. Pockets with internal reinforcements of denser fabric. Buttons not stamped from cheap metal, but cast from quality alloys with detailed symbolism. But the most surprising thing, individual fitting in the early war years. From 1939 to 1941, every SS officer received a uniform that was individually tailored. Measurements, fittings, adjustments, like in an expensive atelier. This was the level of high-end civilian tailoring, not military uniforms. The cost of one SS uniform set in 1938 equaled 125 Reichsmarks, a worker's monthly wage. For comparison, a Soviet gymnasterka cost about 15 rubles, equivalent to a week's wages, and the British Tommy uniform was standardized and cheap, about £2 or 2 weeks of a soldier's pay. But why did the Nazis spend such insane amounts on appearance? Documents from the archives show the Nazis consciously used appearance as a tactical advantage. The Nazi doctrine was explicit about this. German military training manuals and propaganda materials consistently emphasized that appearance was a tactical tool. The message commanders drilled into troops: you must project dominance through every detail of your appearance. This wasn't hidden, it was policy. The strategy had 3 levels. First, external pressure on the enemy. When German troops entered a city, their perfectly pressed uniforms, synchronized marching, polished equipment, and well-groomed faces created a stark contrast. Mandatory shaving every morning, penalties for stubble, impeccable bearing. All this stood against exhausted Polish defenders, poorly equipped French soldiers, and partisans in civilian clothes. Multiple accounts from September 1939 describe the psychological impact of this visual contrast. Polish defenders, after weeks of fighting, exhausted, dirty, and torn uniforms, faced German troops who looked parade-ready. Survivors' testimonies repeatedly mention this shock. It wasn't just military defeat, it was the crushing feeling of facing something that seemed invincible. The enemy saw not just an army, they saw a system, a machine, inevitability. The effect was amplified by the contrast with other countries' outdated equipment. French soldiers in 1940 wore uniforms barely changed since 1918. Baggy trousers, long greatcoats, outdated helmets. Against the backdrop of tailored German tunics, they looked like relics of the past. The second level, internal discipline through appearance. Draconian requirements started with daily boot polishing for at least 30 minutes, many spent over an hour. Pressing uniforms before each formation meant mornings began with ironing, not breakfast. Inspection of buttons, belts, and insignia was merciless. Tarnished metal meant a fine. Mandatory shaving was required even at the front, even at -30, and the slightest violations like dirty nails, unpolished boots, or wrinkled collars were punished immediately. This wasn't about beauty, this was about control. Military psychologists call this discipline through ritual. A soldier who spends 40 minutes polishing boots every morning becomes accustomed to unquestioning execution of meaningless orders. When the order comes to attack a machine gun nest, he goes with the same automaticity with which he polished his boots. German sergeants drilled into recruits, "The enemy must see death in you before the first shot. Your uniform is your first weapon. The third level, propaganda through photography. In the 1930s, the era of mass photography, Riefenstahl, Hoffman, and other photographers received clear instructions. Photograph German soldiers to make them look like heroes of antiquity. Leni Riefenstahl, director of Triumph of the Will, developed an entire shooting methodology. Low camera angles made soldiers taller and more monumental. Backlighting transformed silhouettes into sharp, heroic images. Group shots with perfect symmetry created an impression of order and unshakable discipline. Heinrich Hoffmann, Hitler's personal photographer, shot everyday scenes. Soldiers reading, writing letters, playing cards. But all were in impeccable uniforms. Even rest looked organized and disciplined. The result was millions of propaganda postcards, distributed free throughout Europe. Signal magazine was published in 30 languages, with circulation up to 2.5 million copies. Newsreels played in cinemas across Europe. Before every film, viewers saw 10 to 15 minutes of German newsreels, even in occupied countries. People saw beautiful, strong, organized troops. And then these troops came to their city. The effect multiplied. But there was another trick. Propaganda showed diversity. German uniforms for different service branches differed significantly. Tankers in black, infantry in gray-green, Air Force in blue-gray, mountain troops with edelweiss, submariners with special insignia. Each unit had its own identity, its own visual style. This created the illusion of a huge, diverse, professional military machine. In reality, many units were poorly trained and lightly armed, but they looked like elite forces. It seems simple: give soldiers better uniforms. But this was impossible for most countries. The USSR couldn't manage because industry couldn't provide even basic equipment. There was a constant shortage of fabric, footwear, and buttons, and a mass army of more than 20 million made individual tailoring absolutely unrealistic. Soviet soldiers often received uniforms that didn't fit, too large or too small. Tailoring was out of the question. Documentary evidence shows that in 1941, many Red Army units went to the front in civilian clothes because uniforms simply weren't produced in time. By 1943, the situation improved, but quality always remained basic. The strategy was simple: quantity over quality. Great Britain held to a conservative approach to uniforms, preserving 19th century traditions and prioritizing functionality over appearance. British military doctrine considered excessive attention to appearance a continental weakness. The idea of using uniforms as propaganda seemed ungentlemanly and unworthy of British traditions. A telling case from 1940. British command proposed introducing more tailored uniforms for officers to boost morale after Dunkirk. Conservative generals blocked the proposal, declaring that the British Army doesn't need theatrics. The United States, with mass production reaching 16 million soldiers by 1945, chose standardization for speed and pragmatism. If it works, don't change it. American military industry could produce incredible quantities, millions of sets per month, but quality was average. Uniforms were practical, comfortable, functional, but not beautiful. American soldiers themselves acknowledged this. In veterans' memoirs, a common phrase appears: "We envied German officers' tunics. They looked parade-ready, even in mud." But American command saw no problem with this. Their philosophy: we'll win with numbers and technology, not appearance. France suffered from outdated industry, 1920s-era uniforms, and the financial crisis of the 1930s. French uniforms in 1940 were practically identical to 1918 uniforms. No changes, no improvements. Long greatcoats hindered quick movements, outdated helmet designs, baggy trousers. When French officers saw their German counterparts, the contrast was striking. A French general after the surrender wrote, "We looked like an army of the past, they like an army of the future." Only Germany had the textile industry of the required level. German textile industry in the 1930s was second in Europe after Britain. Only Germany was willing to invest enormous resources in appearance. Up to 15% of the military budget went to uniforms and equipment. And only Germany used forced labor to reduce costs. By the 1940s, Hugo Boss and hundreds of similar factories used prisoners of war from Poland and France, concentration camp inmates from Dachau, Sachsenhausen, and Buchenwald, who supplied slaves to sewing operations, and forced laborers from occupied countries. More than 140,000 forced laborers sewed uniforms for the Wehrmacht. The perfect appearance was built on slave labor. Textile experts from the Deutsches Textilmuseum examined preserved samples and discovered something surprising. The fabric was treated with special coatings. Textile experts examining preserved samples have found that the fabric was treated with chemical compounds beyond standard manufacturing. Water-repellent treatments, wax-based coatings for dirt resistance, and antimicrobial compounds that reduced odor. The specific formulations came from German chemical companies like IG Farben, which was developing advanced synthetic materials throughout the 1930s. The uniform remained visually clean, even if a soldier spent a week in a trench. This wasn't magic, this was chemistry. Textile museums that have examined surviving uniforms note the fabric's unusual durability and resistance to wear. The quality difference between German uniforms and standard military fabrics of the era was significant, something contemporary observers commented on repeatedly. Additionally, double lining was used in critical zones like elbows and knees, where fabric wears out fastest. Reinforced seams at stress points meant double or triple stitching in armpits, crotch, and shoulders. Detachable collars, borrowed from gentlemen's civilian shirt fashion, could be washed separately. A soldier could look fresh with minimal effort. Quick wipe of the uniform with a damp cloth, and it looks almost new again. Change the collar, and it seems like you put on a fresh shirt. This was appearance engineering. Other armies focused on durability and functionality. Germans focused on how it looked. But there was another function of the perfect uniform that's rarely discussed. The uniform erased identity. When everyone is dressed identically, perfectly, flawlessly, individuality disappears. You're no longer Hans or Fritz. You're part of the machine, a cog in the system. Psychologists call this the uniform effect. A person in uniform commits actions they would never commit in civilian clothes. The uniform gives permission. The uniform removes personal responsibility. SS guards at concentration camps wore the same impeccable black uniforms. They polished their boots before going to shoot prisoners. They pressed their uniforms before selections. They wore white gloves during executions. The uniform turned murder into procedure, into routine, into work. One Auschwitz survivor recalled, "The most terrifying thing wasn't their cruelty. The most terrifying thing, they looked parade ready. They killed and looked impeccable, as if it were normal, as if it were just work." The perfect uniform normalized horror. Here's what we know for certain. The Nazi propaganda machine was massive and methodical. Propaganda units, known as Propagandakompanien, or PK for short, were enormous. Every division had a platoon of photographers and cameramen. By 1943, over 15,000 people in the Wehrmacht were exclusively engaged in shooting and distributing images. They selected the most photogenic, tall, with correct facial features fitting the Aryan ideal. They shot after rest and cleaning, never immediately after battle, always after soldiers had washed, shaved, put on clean uniforms. They retouched defects in printing, scratches on faces, dirt on uniforms, exhaustion in eyes. They destroyed unsuccessful shots according to a 1941 instruction requiring destruction of any photograph showing German soldiers in unworthy condition. There was literally a checklist of what was allowed and forbidden. They could photograph soldiers in clean uniforms, eating, only if food looked abundant, resting, only if they looked vigorous, next to equipment. They couldn't show wounded, dead German soldiers, retreat, panic, dirt, chaos. Reality on the Eastern Front in 1943 was completely different. Uniforms in tatters. After Stalingrad, in some units, 70% of soldiers wore captured Soviet clothing. Boots replaced with rags, because German leather footwear couldn't withstand Russian winter. No ironing in trenches at -30, only dirt, blood, and frostbite, which afflicted over 250,000 German soldiers in the winter of 1941 to 42. But these photos weren't published. Moreover, they were actively destroyed. After the war, The Allies discovered enormous archives of forbidden photographs. German soldiers in mud, in fear, in retreat, in torn uniforms. This was the reality that Goebbels wouldn't allow to be shown. The myth of the perfect soldier had to live until the very end. Even in spring 1945, when Berlin was surrounded, propaganda photos continued showing determined defenders in decent uniforms. Allied troops who encountered the Volkssturm, the desperate militia of old men and teenagers, found a very different reality. The gap between image and reality had become a chasm, but the propaganda machine kept running until the very end. All the data shows one thing. The Nazis transformed tailoring into an instrument of war. This was a system created to intimidate the enemy before battle, discipline their own through appearance, create a myth of invincibility through propaganda, depersonalize soldiers, and turn them into obedient cogs in the machine, normalize violence through the aesthetics of order, and use slave labor to conserve resources. A German soldier in 1940 looked better than a French officer. This was a deliberate decision. While other armies thought about functionality, Germany thought about impression. And it worked, until the moment resources dried up, industry collapsed under Allied bombing, slave labor couldn't compensate for losses. By 1944, uniform production dropped 60%, and appearance stopped compensating for military defeats. It's hard to look intimidating when you're retreating on all fronts. But for a brief historical moment from 1933 to 1942, this produced an effect that military historians underestimate. Psychological warfare through appearance was real. It affected enemy morale. It affected the perception of strength. It created an image of invincibility that lived even after the first defeats. When you see archival photos of perfect German soldiers, remember, behind every pressed uniform stood a concentration camp prisoner at a sewing machine. Behind every polished boot, a forced laborer from an occupied country. Behind every flawless shot, hundreds of destroyed photographs of reality. Behind every silver chain, industry working on blood. The Nazis didn't just dress an army, they created a visual illusion of superiority, and the world believed, until the tanks got stuck outside Moscow, and the perfect uniform turned into frost-bitten rags on retreating soldiers. Psychological weapons only work until the moment of collision with reality, but the lesson remained. Appearance matters in war. Not as a replacement for strength, but as an instrument of pressure, demoralization, propaganda. Modern armies understand this. Because history has shown, sometimes how you look can be just as important as what you're armed with.